This is my beautiful title slide. There we go. Has the title of the talk, my name, and our society logo on it. And this is Georgian writing. I think it's Mkhedruli. I'm not sure if it's precisely that one. Anyway, this is the small outline for tonight. So, I'm going to be talking about what writing actually is, definition-wise, and practically as well. What writing systems or scripts are defined as, and what are their building blocks. And basically the whole point is how does the writing and language interact, and how they are not the same, but how they profoundly influence each other. There's going to be some short history of writing. I'm not going to go into detail on this, just because it's fairly complex and most of it is shrouded in dark. And I'm going to go through types of writing systems, which is actually quite important from the point of view of the writing-language relationship. So, what the hell does it actually mean to write? English verb, write, ultimately through all those historical forms, some of them reconstructed, comes from Proto-Indo-European root rei, which means to rip or tear, stuff like that. Polish and general Slavic pisać, and stuff like that, comes from a different Proto-Indo-European root. It's pake, it's to hew, to cut out, embroider, mark. The same root appears in the word picture. Pake, picture, pisati, and so on and so on and so on. Latin, and therefore also all Romance language, scribo, scrivere, and so on and so on, comes from, again, Proto-Indo-European scribe, which is to scratch. So all those words in the end relates to making marks, physically making marks in something. But there are also physical marks. It's carving, it's embroidery, it's not really ink or anything like that. Which becomes quite interesting if you go back in time and look how writing systems used for languages that evolved from Proto-Indo-European actually worked. Latin writing originally was carved. Only later on it became a calligraphic system written using a quill. Slavic languages only adopted writing, and it was already written with a quill, but the notion of making marks was taken over from embroidery. And for Germanic peoples, runes were always carved into stones. It was not something you would paint on stuff. But then, Chinese, I'm not pronouncing this. Mari, you want to have a shot?
It's very soft, so like, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so this write or draw comes from an older meaning that was depict or paint. How does Chinese writing work? Paintbrush, historically. So in the end, writing is a physical activity that has a lot to do with making mark on object in physical world. But this still doesn't get us far in terms of what writing is in relation to language, which is use of graphical symbols to represent linguistic utterances. It's a horrible definition, but in the end it makes sense. It's fairly neutral in terms of what you actually represent, and it sticks with what we do. The one possible exception that I think of would be Braille writing, which is more tactile than visual. But in the end, it's still graphical in the way that it's spatial and so on. It's physical, spatial, you can touch it, you can see it as well. The big thing in massive letters on this slide is that writing is not language. This is what we get put in our heads from day one when we do linguistics. And we're not talking about just written language, we're talking about writing in itself. Imagine if there was no writing in the world. Never ever has anyone written anything. No one ever had a conception of writing stuff. There would still be language. And then, if you strip language of writing as a thing, it's still just fine. There's nothing wrong with it now. Because writing is to language as cycling is to walking. It's a bit weird metaphor / analogy, but bear with me. The idea is that writing is a technology. Cycling is a technology, okay? That makes sense so far. Writing, just as cycling, gets us farther, faster. Basically, it's an improvement, but it's also unnatural. This is something you have to learn, something you can actually unlearn. They say that you can't forget how to cycle, but people can, and it's painful when they try to relearn it. So the point is, it's an improvement, but it's not natural. It takes effort, takes extra resources. Bike is a resource, Quill is a resource for this kind of technology. That would basically it. Does that make sense? Yeah? It's a technology for representation of stuff. Just as language sort of represents concepts most of the time, it's for thinking. It helps us structure thinking and represent it in a way that we can share with each other. Writing represents the language. It restructures it again. We use words to represent those nebulous things in our heads. We use writing to represent this nebulous thing that comes out of our mouths. That means that on the way, some things get lost and some new things get added. And that also means there's a transfer of something from a totally different medium to another. And there we come down to writing systems, or scripts, which is a shorter word and it's much more convenient when you talk about writing as a technology and writing systems, or writing as Chinese writing or Egyptian writing. So I'm going to refer to scripts exclusively as writing systems from now on, and writing as a technology, as a notion that you can take language and represent it physically for time and space for it to last. So what a writing system is, technically speaking, is a specific implementation of the technology that writing is. Sounded a bit complex? Probably. The point is that you have the idea that you can write stuff down. A script is a very specific way of doing it. So we're going to be talking about, say, I don't know, simplified Chinese writing. It's a specific implementation for Mandarin Chinese. We're going to be talking about Latin alphabet for English. Very specific implementation. And so on and so on and so on. The key things about scripts is that their internal structure has little, if nothing, to do with how the language is structured. So what the symbols represent, how they do it, how you put symbols together, will absolutely have little to do with how you put words together and sounds together in those words, and so on and so on. The rules that govern what symbols you can use in what ways and how you put them together are completely arbitrary. Even more so than the language. Language evolves with many people at the same time. It's an established convention. It's relatively easy to come up with a writing system on the spot. You can just make up rules. It's fairly easy. As long as you have a grasp of the language you're trying to write down. That's a task for one day, maybe. And there's the thing, human writing is linear. So you go from point A to point B, you don't spread radially or anything like this. Elements of the writing, so single symbols, might not be linear, so you'd go, I'm gonna have examples for this. There are writing systems that put together their elements from several more, and you don't read them in the same order, you read the whole string of complex symbols like that. Compound Chinese characters come to mind. Accent marks on Latin letters come to mind. You read all human writing in one line, but then additions to symbols and stuff like this may or may not have much to do with how this line works. So this is the building block of every writing, a grapheme. Sounds fairly similar to everyone who already had to handle phonemes. And this is pretty much the same thing. It's a contrastive unit in a writing system, so that means you can tell it apart from the other ones. It's a distinct entity of its own, even though it appears in multiple forms, so you have different A's here, Latin alphabet A's as of 21st century, but a human being identifies all of them as the same thing. A bit of extra knowledge. Different variants of the same grapheme are known as allographs, eerily similar to allophones. Again, free and bound graphemes appear as a term, but most of the time you would refer to just letters and diacritic marks. So letters, A is a perfect example, diacritic mark, accent mark, any kind of an accent mark, acute, graph, and so on and so on. Umlauts, yada 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 yada. There's a lot of those. We use them every day. Well, not in English, in most other languages. So the relation between language and writing is the interesting part. That's when the action happens. I use the word mapping here because what you essentially do is that you take basic elements of the language and you map them onto the elements of writing. So you say that one grapheme in your writing system will stand for something. What's that going to be? This is where different types of scripts come to be distinguished, because in the most basic way you differentiate between scripts that write down sounds and the ones that write down meanings. That's the basic difference. But we also have various orthographies. So this is the case where you have one writing system, Latin alphabet, used for different languages. Hence the wild difference between how Latin alphabet looks like in English and how it looks like in French, even more so Czech, Slovak, Polish, Latvian and Lithuanian, especially those languages, because they are particularly tricky to write down using Latin alphabet. But then it's used for languages of Africa which have sounds like clicks. Latin alphabet maps down sounds. How do you work around that? And an orthography is basically a standardized convention of using one script to write down a specific language. You can have multiple orthographies for the same language. That's where stuff gets very tricky. But that's basically what you have. So where you have to map the language to a script, you have two basic different things happening. First of all, you have to decide what are you actually mapping to their symbols, and then how do you map it. That's a different type of scripts and different orthographies. With me so far? Yeah? Good. Here I have an example of how different orthographies work. I just took the two examples that I'm most familiar with, obviously. So, the letter K in both English and Polish maps down to the same phoneme. It's fairly easy. It's sound K in both languages. Pretty cool. But then the letter C does different things. In English it can be either K or S kind of a sound, depending on context. That's the thing. It's probably some nice regular rule about what vowel follows or stuff like that. This is definitely the case in Italian and I think Spanish as well to an extent, that the letter C is pronounced differently based on what vowel follows it. In Polish, the letter C corresponds to an absolutely ridiculous sound of C that English just doesn't have. Whenever English has to make it, you basically pronounce T and C very quickly together, and you have to write it down. You just write down T and C. Right? Then again, this is an interesting thing. CH is a digraph. Pure writing system that would represent every sound as a separate symbol would never have those. Find me a writing system like this, other than IPA. It's problematic. You have to work around stuff like that. So CH in English is ch. Well, that's pretty obvious. In Polish it's ch. And also the voiced variant h. Where the hell does the difference come from? The things I marked in red, also the R's at the bottom, that's the difference that comes into action because of how different are the phonological systems of the languages. So here I have the situation in it, one writing system was used for two languages with wildly different sound systems, and just different people had to reuse the same symbol set, if you please, for different sound systems, and it obviously resulted into differences on that background. But then the example in blue is where you have two exactly the same sounds, v and w, in both in Polish and English, and they're represented using different letters. Historical reasons again, but they are the same sounds in both languages. This just shows that Latin alphabet was adopted for both of those languages, and it was just adopted very differently. Latin alphabet, as it was originally used in ancient Rome, didn't even have the letter W or the L with the bars, kind of a thing. This kind of difference arises because you have different orthographies. You map sounds differently to different letters. Sometimes you have to make up letters. W arose as a squishing of two V's, as it has in the name. The L with the bar, as historically has been used in Polish for a very long time, and I would struggle to tell you why it was chosen in the first place. However, this is the thing. Writing systems are not one size fits all, except IPA, but it was designed that way. That's why it's so elaborate in how many symbols it uses for all possible sounds, and modifications of those sounds, and modifications of those sounds. Is that clear? Yeah? And then we have different types of scripts. That's the difference not between how you map sounds or things to letters, but what do you actually map to your graphemes. So, and I've grayed out a bit, it's not very visible there. Pictographic and ideographic systems try to write down concepts or images, and the trick is the visual representation as a sequence of time or something like this. This is never considered a true writing system. It's important in the development of writing, but those are often considered not writing, not scripts. This is a way to record information, but it doesn't record language. Then alphabets, fairly straightforward. One grapheme, one phoneme. Be it a vowel, consonant, is going to be a separate symbol. It's supposed to be a separate symbol. Latin alphabet tries to be like this. As we all know, with English and many other languages, hardly ever happens. Abjads, those represent only consonants. They don't write down vowels. Anyone studying Arabic in here? No. Ola didn't make it, I guess. Hebrew, whatever. Those are the primary two languages that stick with with this type of writing. Some of them represent vowels, occasionally, optionally, not by default. Then we've got abugida, or alpha syllabaries, so in which every symbol, every grapheme, every letter, if you please, stands for a vowel and a consonant, or a consonant and a vowel. For all of this, I'll have examples, so this is just a wall of text that's intended to intimidate you just now. Syllabic and moraic system, I just lumped them together because they do a very similar thing. They represent a unit as either a syllable or a mora. A mora is a unit of length, somewhat akin to a syllable in Japanese. It's way shorter structurally. As an example for this, I actually have a moraic writing system, so it's going to be fairly easy to see once you see. And a feature writing system, what those weird systems do, they're very rare. They're very rare. There's only one that I can think of that is actually in active use around the world these days. Every other one is basically an experiment. What you write down is a feature of a sound, not a whole sound. So like in Latin alphabet, in theory, you're writing down whole sounds with one sound, one letter. What they do is one symbol, one letter, stands only for an aspect of a sound. So whether or not it's voiced, or whether or not it's a fricative, and stuff like that. And then finally, morphographemic writing systems, or logographic writing system, try to put down morphemes on paper. Right? And here's a beautiful map of different writing systems, where you can see that Latin is basically massive. All of Americas, Europe, half the Africa, and here, that's all Latin alphabet. You've got several rare writing systems spread over Americas. Those are used for Native American languages, and they tend to be abugidas or syllabaries, interestingly enough. Basically, yeah, the blue ones are alphabets, so Cyrillic here, Greek, and some different blue colors. Yellow, logographic. Orange here, that's abugidas all over the place. And this is Arabic and other abjads. So here's a trick with writing. It's very rarely invented. It's very often, very commonly adopted and modified to suit a different language. For what we know, writing was only invented to last 3 times in human history. Probably more. It just didn't last. We have no evidence that it was actually ever in widespread use. So therefore scientists talk about 3 different families of writing systems: Afroasiatic, East Asian, and American. Fairly easy to pinpoint geographically just by the name. Each of the 3 is believed to have arose separately in little to no contact with each other until very late in its development, to the point at which it was not very relevant to how it developed. And the consequence of that is that each of those families went in a quite different direction in what it represents. American writing systems are pretty much all dead. Those are the writing systems you'd think of as in Aztecs and Mayans and so on and so on, pre-Columbian America. They had a tricky thing in that they, at the same time, represented both meanings, morphemes, and whole syllables. It's quite messy to research, precisely because of that. It's hard to tell what the symbol is representing in a particular context. Also, primarily because at least 50% of Mayan writing is believed to be so-called hapax legomena, which means the symbol is believed to have been not found out in the wild, recorded only once. So we have no extra information. It was used only once, and we have to deduct its meaning just from that one use. It's quite depressing, to be honest. East Asian tradition. The ones in green are still alive, which is quite good news. This only means that only the Korean Hanja are not being used anymore. But it all starts with Chinese writing, which was adopted for Korean, Vietnamese, and Japanese language. Then in Japanese, it developed further into syllabic alphabets that they have. I'm going to get to them. That's one of my examples later on. Vietnamese still uses them, along with modified Latin alphabet. Korean abandoned Chinese characters in favor of a completely different writing system designed from scratch, specifically for Korean, and that's my example of the feature writing system, the one and only in the world that's in any relevant common use. And then you have the sprawling tree for the Afroasiatic tradition. It's horribly drawn, sorry about that, but basically you can go down from Mesopotamian pictograms, so natural writing yet, to Sumerian attempt at writing sounds down. So you would probably go for stuff, oh, here's a picture of a bull. What's the first sound in the bull? B. So we're going to draw a bull to say B. Simple, right? And this is pretty much how writing evolved from back then. Just recycling and simplification over and over again. Egyptian hieroglyphs are the same family, cuneiform, all the scripts here. Early Greek syllables, those are not deciphered very well. And this one in caps is important because all other branches died out. This one had some interesting progeny going on. So from West Semitic alphabet through North Semitic alphabet, we've got Phoenician and Aramaic, and Phoenician alphabet gave rise to what we would consider modern alphabets, the ones that try to represent every sound of their language: Greek, Cyrillic, and Latin. While Aramaic became kept to be an abjad, and that's where Hebrew, Arabic, and Indic scripts, which are Abugida, evolved from. And here we go with Latin. It's one of the purest alphabets, technically speaking, at least originally. It evolved from Phoenician through Greek, through Etruscan writing, and it was known to be used as Latin alphabet from 8th century BC. And it basically has an orthography for every language written around the world. primarily because Western science uses English and other European languages, and they insist on Latin. Major alternative is Cyrillic for Asian languages. Left to right, top down. Fairly simple. We are all very familiar with this one. But there's a trick. The sample on the top is Latin as it was written by the Romans. There's no small caps, and there was no spaces between letters. They would put a small dot, and there was no clear stop at the end of a sentence. There was no they wouldn't distinguish between the sounds of w and u in writing, because why would they? They would sound the same for them, and so on and so on and so on. And here at the bottom, the sample in this corner, it's, I believe, Slovak. Looks absolutely different, because Slovak is a language that has completely different sounds, and it has to be readopted. You have diacritics, so this thing here, accent marks, circles and stuff like that. They do have their specific names, which I just don't remember. Too many to remember. More samples. Albanian in top left corner, again very different. Nawat in left bottom, Welsh in top right, and Old English in bottom right. Written differently. You've got different extra symbols added into some of them. So you've got the letter J in Nawat. It never existed in original Latin alphabet. You've got F and possibly thorn in the Old English here. No, there's no thorn, it's just F. But because you had to represent extra sounds that Latin never had, people had to come up with a way to do it. One way to go around this is digraph. TH in English for the same sound that F used to represent in Old English Latin alphabet. You've got languages that even go for trigraphs, so a combination of 3 symbols to represent one sound. You actually do it in English from time to time as well. TSH for ch, kind of a sound. Arabic. That's an abjad, so consonants only. Vowels are entirely optional. Written from right to left, top down, used from 5th century AD onwards. Basically, most vowels are never written. What you would write as a first thing was long vowels, then you would maybe go for short vowels. Traditionally, the exception from this is Quran, in which you would write down everything. This is the same text, with the top one being how Arabic is usually written, without the extraneous vowel sounds. The bottom one actually preserves all of them. You can tell there's lots more dots and scribbles around the proper symbols than in the top sample. Oh, by the way, all the samples I have here is the first article of Declaration of Human Rights, so all humans are equal, and so on and so on. Just took them for all the languages and writing system to keep it fairly consistent. Beats the Paternoster, which is the preferred sample for the ethnologue, if I remember correctly. Devanagari, or something like that. My pronunciation for Hindi is probably atrocious. It's the first true abugida that we've got here. So, as I've got by example up on top, what you write down by default is a consonant and a vowel sound. They're paired together forever. But if you modify that symbol, you can get rid of the vowel. So technically speaking, you've got series of symbols with the basic form always being consonant and a. And then you apply the same filters to that basic symbol to rip off the vowel, change the vowel to e, change the vowel to u, change the vowel to e. So you can see that kind of accenty symbol here that rips off the vowel sound. Whenever it appears like that, for example here in the sample and here, that means the vowel is gone. And so on. It's used for Hindi, Sanskrit, Nepali, Marathi, vast majority of Indian languages, but not all of them. It's a member of a very extensive family of writing systems that were just arose in India to write down all the Indian languages, which there's a multitude of. In its current form, it's been used from 12th century onwards. Right, Hanzi, I hope. It's a morphographemic but also morphosyllabic system. Why is it called morphosyllabic? Because it just happens that nearly every morpheme in Chinese is a syllable. Used at least from the Bronze Age. That's how far we can go, which is quite impressive considering that Latin is like just 8th century BC, really. Because every symbol is separate morpheme, you have tons of symbols. There are different estimates for them. There are different attempts at standardizing this for different languages, for Chinese separately, for each dialect separately, I presume, for Japanese separately, and so on and so on. It's estimated just that for pure good old Mandarin Chinese, there's around 100,000 symbols, possibly more. 2,600 are estimated to be the minimum viable amount to survive. You'd probably need more to go through a newspaper. They're also used by Japanese, but in a different way. Because in Chinese, each symbol tends to have one meaning, because it's one syllable. Fairly reasonable. And what Japanese did when they adopted the writing, they kept the Chinese meanings and they added their own on top of them. And the two are hardly ever related, which makes it a massive pain to learn Japanese, even for the Japanese people. A minimum viable amount of kanji, as Japanese people refer to them, is 1945, something like that. This is what you're supposed to get from school, but you won't manage to go through a newspaper and have a book even more so with just that. Practically, Hanzi? Okay, I give up. Written left to right, top down, horizontal lines, but historically they're written top down, right to left. So lines would be vertical. Right, with me so far. Anyone asleep? Evelyn. And that's the Japanese thing. It's a Moraic syllabary, because Moraic writing systems are classed as subset of syllabaries. One grapheme corresponds to a mora. It's from simplified forms of Chinese characters that were related phonetically long time ago when the system was developed. Used at least from 9th century onwards. That's when it was popularized for the first time. Used for Japanese and Okinawan, written just as Chinese characters were. Because what Japanese people did, it's a massively crazy thing. They mix all three writing systems they have together. Got a sample for that. But what is that mora thing? So Japanese is not... English is timed by stress. So you have relatively regular intervals between stress in a sentence and so on and so on and so on. Just keep a rhythm like that. Japanese has a completely different thing. A syllable can be broken down into smaller units that last the same amount of time. This is a mora, or mora. Each mora is supposed to last the same amount of time, no matter how fast you speak. This ends up with the word for mora looking like that. It's 3 characters in Japanese writing, even though it's 2 syllables. Because long o is 2 mora. A mora is basically defined as a consonant and a short vowel on its own, or that thing, consonant, short vowel. There's only one consonant that can appear on its own as a mora, which is n. But I'm not going into details of Japanese writing just now, no way. But you have an example here, how it breaks down. 2-syllable word, mora, is actually 3 mora. The 2-syllable word Tokyo, 4 mora. This here is a smaller sized character which marks the y sound in Kyo. So basically, it's supposed to all last the same amount of time. Right? Makes sense? Pure syllabaries would have a whole syllable represented with one character. Those are extremely rare. But you can pull them off in languages, especially the languages of Native American peoples, which would have very simple syllable structure. So it was just like a consonant vowel kind of a structure. It's really easy. You don't need a massive amount of characters to pull that off. But consider what you have to do with English. English has a fairly complex rules of putting together sounds and syllables. Lots of work. And here's an example. The grayed out characters are the Chinese characters. Everything else is hiragana as it's used in everyday usage. So you can tell that it's all like a considerable portion of Japanese writing is actually Chinese writing. They have tricks to get around the double extra meanings. So whenever you see something like this, Chinese characters followed closely by a hiragana character, that means this is the end of the pronunciation for this. That way people know what this actually stands for, which may or may not be the original Chinese meaning of that character, compound, whatever. Right? And then we go to Hangul. That's the Korean script. That's the only featural script that is actually used around the world. So the trick is that a grapheme is made up of sub-elements that each represent phonetic features. This is a beautiful colored example at the corner, which is probably going to explain everything way better than I could. Each block, each square block in Hangul is pretty much a syllable in its own right, but how its sub-elements are put together is a fairly elaborate rule system. But then each of those elements stands for a sound. The way this element looks depends what kind of sound it is, and not in the arbitrary way of Latin alphabet. It means that the top right example here, this symbol that looks roughly like a capitalized E stands for T, actually aspirated T. But the top bar means it's a plosive, it's a stop. Alright? Middle bar means it's an aspirated stop. And the bottom bar means an alveolar stop. Matches perfectly with how we describe the sound T in phonology and phonetics and so on and so on. What this lacks is voicing, because voicing is an extra thing you add on sounds, if it happens. So if you have a look at this, you see that elements repeat a lot in written Hangul. This circle is the same sound in different syllables. This here would be different sounds, but they're very similar for some reason. Actually, this would be the same sound, this would be a different vowel. Right? That's the last example. Everything clear so far? Any questions?
Yeah. Do the people actually know who speak this language that the definitions of plosive, aspirated, alveolar?
That's the trick. No.
No.
You didn't notice this stuff when you use it. It's not native knowledge. But when you learn the alphabet, even as a kid, what people tend to do is that they tend to arrange similar sounds together. So you kind of get an intuitive grasp that those sounds have something in common. This is sort of the case with hiragana as well, in that Japanese only has 5 vowels, but has multiple consonants. Basically what you have in hiragana is 45 symbols? 46. Thank you. 46 symbols, which are traditionally arranged on a grid. 5 by... how many? Do the math. 9. So you have a top series, which is just vowels. A, I, U, E, O. And then the first series after this is the first consonant. Ka, ki, ku, ke, ko. It goes on like that. So we've got arrangements like this are very typical in the systems that pair consonants and features, stuff like that. So we would have a grid for hiragana, and Hangul is learned similarly. You have a similar thing going on for the Abugida, the Indian writing systems, Devanagari being the example from today. Even for artificial writing systems, whenever they are designed in that way, people tend to follow this kind of thing. It's actually quite controversial to refer to writing system as artificial. It's artificial anyway. It's just how long have you been using it is the difference. So that's the trick. So basically the point is that the relation between writing and language is of representation. It's complicated. It's a mapping of different elements in different ways. That's the differences between writing systems and orthographies. Invention of writing is very rare. Adaptation and borrowing is very common. That results in a lot of idiosyncrasies. How the English is written, how basically every language that uses Latin alphabet is written in a very weird way if you consider how Latin alphabet used to work back in the day. Applies again to Chinese characters when they were adopted into Japanese. Japanese people just added another layer of meanings onto them, which ended up with them having to develop the syllabaries to make their lives easier to understand their own texts, because they ended up with symbols that had too many meanings. If you look up a dictionary of Japanese used Chinese characters, you'll have lists of 5-6 meanings per character. That's a nightmare. It's really not that way in Chinese. I made sure to look it up. It's completely different. That's why Japanese people basically have to use the syllabaries in conjunction with Chinese writing. Why did they never switch just to the syllabaries? Beats me. I have no idea. And here's a very interesting thing. Writing systems are very rarely pure. So I talked about all those types, like alphabets, oh yes, one phoneme per symbol, and so on and so on. This hardly ever happens. Hardly any writing system is pure. Most of them are very mixed, very messed up. Remember what I mentioned about the American family of writing systems, in that they used symbols that are at the same time referring to like a meaning, a concept, but also to a whole syllable. But sometimes it was several syllables as well, to make everyone's lives easier. This is the case. There's no such thing as a pure writing system. You have a mess all the time, everywhere. Because the systems evolve and develop along the language, but at a different pace, in a different way. You end up with idiosyncrasies all over the place. But then the thing that put in italics, it's my own private theory, that languages that actually create their own writing systems tend to create things that are fairly well suited to them. Chinese writing system is like the best example probably. One syllable per symbol. That makes sense. It makes sense given the phonology of Chinese as well. It would be quite problematic to represent tones with... I mean, you can pull it off in IPA, obviously. We use diacritic marks for this when you transcribe Chinese into Latin. But given the limited amount of syllables and so on, it makes sense. But then, Arabic and Hebrew are languages that do the bulk of their grammatical workings by swapping vowels or getting rid of them between consonants. Even more so, they have a 3 consonant roots. So k, t, v is a root in Hebrew that pertains to everything that has something to do with writing. By inserting different consonants between those, removing consonants, and so on, you create different words, different forms of words. You do all the magic. And then they use the writing system that considers vowels fairly optional to preserve the integral meaning of the consonant roots. And this is why Quran is considered poetic, but digressing again. And then, Indo-European languages that we are speaking just right now, a lot of weird sound changes all the time. English doesn't do it much, because English doesn't do much grammar those days, but it used to be a nightmare. And it only made sense to have a writing system that preserves sounds as they are, because of how much the sounds used to change. It's shoddy, but it's something I think is probably worth researching if there's some kind of, something going on in there. Yeah, it's a quiz, but I figured out this is gonna be horribly hard because I already have sort of a reputation for horrible questions and making things very hard. So if you manage, I'll be very proud of you guys. What is that? Louder.
Ancient Greek.
Yes, it's ancient Greek. It's not modern Greek. Why? Does the stone give it away that it's ancient? So yeah, Greek is an alphabet. The idea behind is that each symbol represents a sound. And for most of history, Greek alphabet actually managed to keep that. There's little to no mess going on, even in modern Greek, even though it's changed a lot. What is tricky is that between ancient and modern Greek, some symbols change the sound they represent, but they're still there. What is that? Obviously Asian, but I'm not talking about the red seals in the background. Red seals in the background use Chinese writing. Any clue? Not Japan.
Tibetan?
Nope. Farther to the north. There's a country in Asia, Central Asia, very flat place. People tend to forget about it a lot. Bingo. It's actually, this is the interesting thing, it's an Asian script, but it's an alphabet as well. And it has a very tricky feature in that each one of those vertical blocks is a word. Each symbol, each letter in Mongolian alphabet has 3 different forms, based on whether or not it's at the start of the word, at the end of the word, or somewhere in the middle. That pertains to all Mongolian letters, no matter whether or not it's consonant or so on and so on. It's a very interesting writing system, looks very funky. But as you can tell, there's also Chinese seals in the background just because of the constant cultural contact and exchange. What on earth is that? There's no way you would know. So the whole thing is a ceremonial liver for divination. Anyone's got a clue? Was that helpful? Divination from animals inside was very common in, well, ancient Europe, especially Mediterranean. This is an alphabet as well. It's actually the ancestor to one of the things that we are using every day. It's Etruscan. It's Etruscan, and it's a pain to decipher just because we don't know anything about Etruscan language really. It had some impact on Latin alphabet, but the two were not really related very closely. Arguably they were both members of the Italic language family, but that doesn't really help us with Etruscan. What's that? That's easy. That's runes, and the stone itself is from Sweden, I believe. But it was painted over. Scandalous. True Vikings would never paint things. What's that? Whoa. That's a weird thing. Eastern Europe.
The old church.
That's the language, but what's the writing? Okay, it's Glagolitic. It's indeed Old Church Slavonic as a language. This alphabet was used for a brief time before Cyrillic took over, and took off as a big thing in Eastern Europe. It was like, whoa, Cyrillic, it's so easy to write Slavic language with Cyrillic, you have no idea. But bothers me a lot. This politics and church, why Polish, Czech and Slovak don't use Cyrillic is purely because of which church we chose to ally ourselves with in early Middle Ages. This was the first attempt at that. The symbols were just too hard to write and they're a bit too complicated to be reasonably useful. Cyrillic was simpler and it's easier to write in all kinds of ways. Glagolitic is weird to get a hang on. That's easy. What's the direction of writing on this one? Can anyone tell me which way you would read that?
It was top down.
I'm talking like to left to right or right to left. Obviously top down, yeah, top down. But left to right? Right to left.
Right to left.
Why? There's a clue. The trick is with hieroglyphics, they could be read both ways. But every text ever written in Egyptian hieroglyphs contains explicit instruction in which way it should be read. The letters themselves tell you which way you should read them. Look at the birds and people, they always face in the same direction. And they face in the direction you should be going from. They look forward to you reading them, basically.
Why?
So you start at the right because they're looking to the right.
Exactly. You would always start at the top, but you would they always look at the start point. Oh, by the way, I'm going to go back to ancient Greek for a second. That thing, there's a tricky thing about ancient Greek. Greek in those days is written left to right. It's fairly standard for European languages those days. But before that, in ancient times, ancient Greek didn't have a codified reading and writing direction. Any way would work. And one of the classically Greek thing is called the boustrophedron, in which you would have an indicated place to start, and text would just wind in any direction it wanted to. You just had to follow it. Basically like a snake, changing direction every line. Most of the time. Sometimes go absolutely mental on the page. But most of the time it's just change direction every line. You just have to figure out where to start. Very weird thing. But it was in use for many centuries as well.
Casper?
Yes?
The hieroglyphics. I thought they were vertical. Like I saw a documentary the other day and they were vertical in the tombs.
If you had like cartouches like that, you're talking about stuff like seals that were looking like
no, like on the walls of the tombs. They were vertical.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
No way. Absolutely no way. Unless it would.
Well, maybe in particular contexts they used vertical writing. Like, you know, there's spinning signs outside hairdressers. We use vertical writing, but we generally tend to be horizontal.
I mean, as far as I know, hieroglyphic writing in a standard way was always used horizontally. When you had vertical forms, there would be like cartouches and stuff like that.
I've only ever seen it vertical.
I remember going to an Egyptian museum.
Homework time! Good, good.
Just write our name with hieroglyphics vertically.
Alright.
So, it may be a widely held misconception that we could help debunk. Or
Well, maybe it was just a mess and they wrote in every direction they wanted to, which is often the case. What's that? It's Mayan, yeah. This is one of those crazy writing systems that each symbol can stand for different things, really. You have to figure it out as you go. It's really hard. Half of it is undeciphered because hapax legomenon, written only once.
Fun fact, up to like the 19th century they actually thought it was just pretty pictures.
Yeah.
So they figured out it was writing. Wait, some of these parts are repetitive.
Yeah, just because of how it looks, it was for a very long time absolutely dismissed as an idea that it could be a writing system.
Casper, could you explain to us a little more fully what you mean when you say hapax legomenon?
It's a Greek phrase, it means said only once. So when you have a word or something like that, or a phrase that appears only once in given context, that's the term you would use. In linguistics it's used for something, precisely a word or a symbol, something like that has ever been only recorded only once. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah? So many of the symbols, classes, hapax legomenon. You can narrow down the set to like works of a specific author and stuff like that. But I'm talking about like the whole language wise. All that we know about it, it appeared only once, we have no idea what to do with it. What's that? It's very old Chinese, yeah. It's the seal script. One of the older forms, I think 500 or 1000 BC even. You can tell just by how differently it's written. That? Yes, it's 3 different languages at the same time. It's a bit of a Rosetta Stone situation going on in here. It's 3 different languages couldn't remember which ones for the life of me. I'm pretty sure one of them would be Hittite and one would be Akkadian or something like that. It's basically plaque erected as a memorial to a peace treaty between 3 different states. That not Arabic.
Hebrew?
Is Hebrew. It's just an old sample of Hebrew.
What
from
language do the Yiddish speak? They speak
Yiddish is a language.
Yeah, that was stupid.
It's still written with Hebrew alphabet, Hebrew writing. Wait a second.
Wait, so the dots are vowels?
Yeah, dots, lines, all the extra symbols would be vowels.
Is it
The-
what Tolkien, right? Tolkien's Tengvar has
Yeah.
dots and vowels.
I presume it's either Arabic or Hebrew that he pulled it from, yeah. But the trick about Tengwar is that it's both an abjad and it's also featural. It's featural when it comes to consonants. You get consonants arranged in a series that are visually similar based on whether or not it stops, fricatives, and so on and so on. While vowels are optional, well, not optional, but diacritic marks. And that's absolutely horrible of me to include that. Anyone takes a guess? Starts with an A. Not Aramaic. It still has R and M in it. Armenian. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, it's Armenian. It's sorta in decline those days just because no one really uses it outside of Armenia. But there you go. Yeah. Awesome. You got it all? Splendid. I'm proud. And this is a sculpture of writing herself. Don't remember where from. Somewhere in New York, I think. Bob. That's cool books that you can look up about this stuff. They're all in our library, so that's why I've included those horrible things here. I need the bibliography myself, you know.